how is it that certain chemically set up food additives could be responsible behind either aggravating leaky gut, and in some people who are more sensitive, because everybody's body is different. I was just telling you about a friend of mine who's been on the podcast before, Vani Hari, the food babe. And for her in particular, food additives were a major part of her eczema and skin issues that she had. So what's going on in that situation? What inside of the body that would be disrupting the gut?
I think there's two kind of clear scenarios. One is the food additive, whether it's an artificial dye or sweetener or filler or gum, is directly causing permeability, breakdown, leaky gut, and therefore damaging the immune system in that kind of direct way. We're consuming it. The gut lining is going to be exposed to it. If it directly damages the gut lining, that's pretty straightforward.
The damage that it's doing, does it also mean that sometimes it could be acting like its own little antibiotic in that area? Or is it inflammation? Like, how is that actual damage? Like, how is it killing off the healthy stuff that we have there inside of our gut? Do we know?
It depends on the chemical. So some of the chemicals do have actual septic effects, so they can antiseptic effects, so they can cleanse the bacteria of the healthy bacteria, or cleanse the gut of healthy bacteria. So acting like an antibiotic. Some of them will directly open the barrier. Gums are a very good example of something that will directly open the barrier. The problem with gums specifically, which I think is the big culprit in the food additive world, is some of them don't even need to be labeled.
And just so people are clear, because some people are like, wait, is he talking about chewing gum?
No.
Like, what is he talking about? Okay, so when you say gums, what are gums and what are some common food products? And then what would be on the label that we would often be looking at to see, does this product have this gum inside of it?
Thanks for asking. So gums are emulsifiers or thickening agents. So think of chewing gum, but trying to create that elasticity or thickness to food. And there are many different forms of gums: guar gum, carrageenan, xanthan gum, locust bean gum. These are all examples of different thickening agents or emulsifiers that are used in the food industry to provide essentially texture differences to food, right?
To create that mouth feel that often people are looking for.
Yes, right. I'll give you a great example of where they're used very widely. Ice cream, in particularly vegan ice cream, because you're not going to get that, like thick milk fat consistency by using almond milk or coconut milk or whatever it is you decide to use. So to recreate that experience to the mind and the body, to convince you that you're having regular cow's milk ice cream, gums are used to thicken.
Yeah. There was a really amazing, I'm not vegan, but it's a vegan ice cream I came across here at Air one of our favorite stores locally. The Money Pit. And I came across it there, and it was a I love the fact that it had just a couple ingredients inside, right? It had like cacao, sea salt, water, and allulose, which, we'll talk about in a second, but it's a non-sugar sweetener alternative, and a lot of health products are using it. I'd love to get your take on the situation. And it had xanthan gum in it. Yeah. And I tried it and I loved it because we do a lot of episodes on blood sugar. Like, wow, this is great because it has allulose in it. It's not spiking my blood sugar. I don't eat ice cream all the time. And I emailed the founders and I said, hey, listen, just want to share myself, Dr. Hyman, a lot of the experts that have been on our podcast. We're not usually the biggest fan of xanthan gum. Do we think it's the worst thing in the world? No, you're just trying to balance everything out. But long-term, for a health aware audience, if possible, it'd be a good thing to look at some alternatives in the manufacturing process. And they were so sweet. They were like, oh my gosh, we didn't know. We'll definitely look into it. Let's see what other alternatives are there. But you're right. They're in a lot of vegan products that are there. So in the case of these gums, right? And you mentioned a few of them that are out there. Do we understand exactly the ways that they're creating disruption? Going back to the last question I asked, is it like a cleansing effect? Is it like sort of antiseptic effect, or are we not really fully sure?
I think there's two big ways that it can cause an immunological problem that we're sure about. I am sure that there are many that we don't know about in totality. One will be direct damage to the barrier. So gums can directly go in, let's say like gluten, and just, activate the zonulin pathway, create leaky gut, essentially. The other way is that some individuals will actually create immune responses to gums. So again, let's say somebody has non-celiac gluten sensitivity. That's an issue where the immune system is inappropriately identifying a food as a target and creating an immune response, including antibodies to it whenever you ingest it. The same thing can happen to a gum.
Got it.
So you can either immune attack or it'll open up your barriers, or both, right? And there are plenty of other things that it can do.
There is one gum product that's out there that I believe is like not in the same category of the gums. And a lot of wellness products use it, like a lot of the functional medicine products. It's called acacia gum.
Yeah.
And that's just straight up acacia fiber.
Yep.
But I think they have to call it gum on the label.
Correct.
That's not what you're talking about here.
No.
Okay.
No. So
great.
acacia gum, sun fiber, whatever term you're going to use, let's call that a prebiotic.
Right. These are prebiotics.
This is a direct emulsifier, thickening agent, texture modifier for food. Though they can act as prebiotics in some situations, they're mostly directly harmful.
I asked you about allulose.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about allulose?
I think allulose is a little hit or miss depending on the individual. I think some people, again, it's very hard to predict how a microbiome is going to react to something. Is it going to digest it and ferment it rapidly and create a large amount of gas, and that gas cause discomfort? Or is the microbiome not going to be able to ferment it at all and it'll just pass through? It's very individual. For people who can tolerate it, my blessings for sure.
It's interesting because, and again, for those that are not familiar, allulose is a non-sugar, doesn't spike your blood sugar. It can be extracted from, I believe, figs, kiwi, a lot of things, but, and this is an area where a lot of people are like cautiously optimistic, and the cautious part primarily comes from this, is that most of the allulose that's on the market today is extracted from, what I understand, from wheat and corn. It doesn't have any wheat and corn inside of it, and the companies test and everything else like that, so it doesn't show up on any of these sensitivities. But that's the easiest way to get the chemical extraction out for this chemical compound that is similar to sugar but is not sugar in the body. If I have a little bit and I have a product that has a little bit in it, totally fine. Because I'm always trying things, and I know I'm an N of 1 situation. I added a lot to a latte that I was making one time, like 2 tablespoons of like pure, or like 3 tablespoons of like pure allulose. And I had what would be sort of like a little bit of like digestive upset. Hey, it's a health podcast, so we could say it. I basically had diarrhea.
Yeah.
So some things can be good a little bit, and maybe some things a lot may not be good, and it might vary different people. But it does seem that people are cautiously optimistic, because it seems to be that if we can get people off of some sugar in some instances, it could be beneficial. And then again, a lot of functional medicine doctors also say that, look, it's not that we should be afraid of sugar. We just don't want to be having it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So the occasional sugar here and there is totally fine.
Yeah.
We also don't want to be having allulose breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Yeah.
So that's the whole allulose monologue that I have.
I like it. I agree with it. I'm on board with your model.
We talked about food, and food is a big part of your book here, When Food Bites Back. In the instance of top foods that people are eating today that we know are connected to leaky gut in one way or another, you mentioned 2 right off the bat. You talked about dairy and gluten. Would you put those 2 in, let's say, your list of top, 10 foods that are often linked with leaky gut?
Yeah, those are number 1 and 2 without question. And not just link with leaky gut, but link with systemic autoimmunity, specific systemic autoimmunity. So those are the kings of the hill. No question. And
autoimmunity, a few years ago when we when I first got in the space of functional medicine, before I started working with Dr. Hyman, I had another business partner. I heard people talking about autoimmunity a lot at the functional medicine conferences, different doctors and things like that. I thought, autoimmunity is so rare. Like, why is it being talked about so much? Then I finally looked up the stats. It's not rare at all.
Yeah.
Tell us about how popular autoimmunity is, and why is it that in particular, which is going to be really interesting for this audience, my audience is probably about 80% women. Why is this topic so important for especially women to pay attention to?
Yeah. So depending on the statistic metric that you want to look at, somewhere between 10 to 15% of the current US population has a known diagnosed autoimmune disease.
Okay. Nuts.
The reason that's, if you want to put that together with, let's say, Alzheimer's disease or cardiovascular disease, we're talking about equal portions of the population actively impacted. There's a couple of reasons why that isn't palpable day to day, or it doesn't get talked about that much. The biggest of which is that autoimmune diseases get segmented into different subspecialties of medicine. In other words, there is no quote unquote autoimmunologist in medicine. There is no autoimmunology residency. You don't go to an autoimmunologist.
Because they think of them all as separate things.
Right. You have Hashimoto's, you go to an endocrinologist. You have Crohn's, you go to a GI doctor. You have MS, you go to a neurologist. So we lose the ability to think of this as an immunological disease, which it is. Not that those people aren't, good at treating them. It's you forget that this is a very, very big bucket. Now, those are conservative estimates. And on average, an autoimmune disease from when it is formed in the bloodstream, so when you start developing the antibodies against the tissue and the person gets diagnosed with the autoimmune disease, is about 8 to 10 years. So if those metrics are conservative, they're also reflective of what was going on actively in our bloodstream 10 years ago. So I think those of us in this world who live and breathe it every day think that number is probably closer to 20%. If you look at good studies that look at the nationwide seroprevalence of autoimmune markers like a positive ANA or a positive cardiolipin, we had that at about 11% 10 years ago. I think, again, that number is probably 15 or 20% right now. It is a huge, huge problem.
Women. Why is autoimmunity a topic that everybody should pay attention to, but women in particular?
It's mostly conjecture at this point, right? We kind of look at the past and say, well, what's the difference between, men and women to explain this, right? We know autoimmune disease is an environmental disease, right? So that means that let's put over 2/3 of the risk of autoimmunity is environment versus genes. And
environment means everything from food to chemicals to stress, like the larger environment that we're surrounded by.
Everything we've been talking about, right? Put a huge number of things into that bucket, but the environment. And women are unfortunately exposed to more in the environment than men are. That's most likely secondary to cosmetics. And on top of it, hormonal changes influence the immune system, right? A perfect example of that is, let's say a woman unfortunately has psoriasis, goes into pregnancy. Typically in the second and third trimesters of pregnancy, that psoriasis will on its own reduce its activity, and because hormones have an impact on the immune system. So of course, women have a more diverse range of sex hormones. There's more influence of the immune system. There's more fluctuation intra-month of their sex hormones. So that's likely the secondary kicker there, is why women experience 3 times more autoimmunity than men.
Right. In your book, you open it up with 70 to 80% of almost all autoimmune diagnoses fall on women.
Yeah.
You mentioned makeup.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about makeup for a second. Cosmetics. Makeup is one category of that, but just let's go cosmetics, stuff we put on our hair, stuff we put elsewhere. Obviously, there's such a burden that's placed on just the way that the world works on women and their appearance. And there's actually a really good book, if anybody's interested. There's a PhD researcher. Her name is Luann Brisdine. She wrote a book called The Female Brain.
Mm-hmm.
She also wrote a book called The Male Brain.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks about why, from a young age, biologically female brain, biologically male brain, why is it that certain, a brain would pay attention to more, this aspect or another aspect? Why is it that men have more neuro connections front to back and women have more from one hemisphere to another hemisphere? Mm-hmm. How does that play out in evolutionary biology? But cosmetics, how do those impact the body and the gut, which ultimately impacts autoimmune?
Yeah. Let's do the gut part first. Okay. So an individual is putting things on their skin on a daily basis. Those, the skin is, again, an analog to what's going on inside of the gut from a physiological perspective. We're covered in epithelial cells here. We're covered in epithelial cells down there. What you do to the epithelial cells here impact them here, and vice versa. So what you put on your skin on a daily basis can impact the health of your gut. They're the same style of cells, and the immune system connects the two areas. So something can disrupt the barrier on your skin. It can disrupt the barrier in your gut. And if there's something that has antimicrobial effect on your skin and you're using it every day, it's going to have some cumulative antimicrobial effect on your gut. And those chemicals directly in cosmetics, they have an incredible amount of stress to the immune system associated with them.
And one of the aspects is that, people like to talk about a lot of industries being unregulated. Cosmetics is completely unregulated.
That's the biggest problem. If I'm gonna list off the list of things that are bad in, let's say, mascara or foundation or lipstick or lotion, right? There are going to be things that you can find that are in there that are listed, and there are going to be things that are not listed because they're not mandated to be listed.
That also includes fragrances as well.
Absolutely.
We don't really know what's inside of them. They seem very innocent. They seem very, like, wow, it's just a fragrance. Like, what's the big deal? There's all sorts of phthalates, chemicals, things that we have no idea. And they are trade secrets because these companies don't want anybody to know.
Right.
We have no idea what's inside of them. And they also want to protect them because they don't want somebody else to copy it. But we as a consumer end up suffering.
Yeah. And, outside of cosmetics, unfortunately, there is a tremendous amount of societal pressure on biological females in our society to continue to look good, continue to look young. I'm not even going into the injectable or plastic surgery world, but there's a tremendous amount of chemical exposure that happens there as well too. So in the short run, women are really unfortunately impacted by our world.
It's on the positive side, it's great to see so many cleaner cosmetics show up, and organizations like Environmental Working Group having a database. And there's another company that, I was an advisor to, a nonprofit that helps sort of vet a lot of these. It's called Made Safe.
Yep.
And they're doing some really great work. So I'm excited that in all the messiness and the craziness of the world, there are people that are stepping up that say, okay, great. People want to look good. Men want to look good. Women want to look good. Let's flag products as being safer for them, which we definitely need more of in this world.
And let's also say that if that risk doesn't come in, let's say, the decades of 30, 40, or 50 as an autoimmune disease,
yes,
women are also 3 times more likely to experience neurodegeneration and a neurodegenerative disease than men.
Right. Your body can say ouch in different ways. One way of saying ouch is an autoimmune disease, which, again, most people don't say I have an autoimmune disease. They'll say I have Graves' disease, I have Hashimoto's, I have, something, another MS. And if it doesn't end up happening as an autoimmune disease, it could end up happening as something else. We had brain researcher on the podcast, Dr. Lisa Mosconi, and she wrote a book called The XX Brain and talked about why is it that women are more likely to get Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
What's going on in this instance? And it's not because women live longer. We used to think it was that, but it's actually because of all the reasons that you had listed a little bit earlier. So I want to go back to leaky gut and autoimmunity. Those two things are very much connected. And question that I have for the audience, can somebody develop autoimmune issues or eventually a diagnosis of some of the diseases that we mentioned? And there's many others. I think there's total like more than 80 plus different diseases that fall under the bucket of autoimmunity. Can someone get an autoimmune disease without having leaky gut?
I think the answer to that is yes. It is not necessary for leaky gut to be a part of autoimmunity. I think you're going to be hard pressed to find an autoimmune disease that doesn't, in at least the medical literature, have an association between the gut abnormality and the systemic autoimmune disease, but they definitely don't have to overlap. I think it's just incredibly common. And at the end of the day, I think you're also going to be very hard pressed to find a human being who has not had intestinal permeability at some point in their life.
I came into your office a few months ago because I was like, I'm starting to notice a little bit of dryness on my skin, a couple other things. I had a flag of some thyroid antibodies being up a couple years ago. I was like, you know what? Let me go to the expert. Let me go to the man, right? So I came to you and I said, can we run some of these top, leaky gut intestinal permeability panels. So
Mhm.
can you talk about big picture, like what tests did you run for me and how
Sure.
did you look into that?
Sure. So Dr. Fasano is the brilliant pediatric GI who discovered zonulin, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't his intention, by the way. He was looking into infectious disease that debilitated third world children and was studying Vibrio cholera, but, ended up in understanding Vibrio, learning about zonulin. So,
And his work was a huge part of the reason that people started to understand that you could have non-celiac sensitivity to things. Because
Correct.
before it was like, either you are celiac, which means you have a gluten intolerance, like for real, like it's like there in your body, you cannot handle it, or you're not. And then his work really changed the game with that space.
Absolutely. It gave us a completely different look at autoimmunity and the gut and the role between the two of them. So he looked specifically for the protein zonulin, right? And I think that the first generation of leaky gut testing was looking essentially to mirror what happened in his laboratory setting. So they were doing zonulin levels either in stool or blood. Now, the research setting is not the same thing as the clinical setting, right? If you find something that is relevant and meaningful in the research world, it doesn't always mean it's going to be a great metric in a clinic because it won't meet the very strict criteria of being reliable enough. That happened, in my opinion, with zonulin, and also according to research I did with my dad. Basically, what we found was that when there's a leaky gut issue and you release zonulin either into the blood or into the stool, most likely into the blood, it fluctuates too much over the course of 24 hours for it to be a really reliable diagnostic marker. Now, sometimes the immune system can help you out by doing something it's not supposed to be doing. In that situation, you're releasing zonulin into the blood. That's not a protein that the immune system has never seen before. So it's going to start reacting to it, and it'll start creating antibodies. Now, antibodies are fortunately very stable over periods of time. We don't release a lot, then release a little, or release a lot. We release steady streams of them based on exposure. And they're very easily detectable using the gold standard antibody detection technique from the 80s called ELISA. So if you look for antibodies to zonulin, you will therefore have a much more stable, reliable pathway of trying to measure whether that person has leaky gut by looking for antibodies to the actual protein zonulin. So that's what we did for you. And a study that we published looking at the utility of antibodies to zonulin versus zonulin levels was published in 2017 in the World Journal of Gastroenterology, confirming that it was about twice more sensitive than zonulin levels themselves.
Well, the good news is you ran mine, and I didn't have any kind of flags that were there. We didn't really find anything, which was, knock on wood, a good situation for me. And I still went to go dig into a little bit of the reasons why I might have some dry, patchy skin. And, my wife always got humor. She's like, babe, you just need to use lotion. Like, that might be right. That might be right. That could be the reason why my hands are dry all the time. Plus, the world has been washing its hands, and everywhere you go,
Yep.
that could be a part of the reason that was the case. In those instances, you write about this in the book, and I think this is worth talking about here, is that you cannot go online, and if you're in the world of health or you're watching YouTube ads and you've looked at health videos before, at some point in time, you're going to see a video from somebody saying, hey, great, get this at-home test and you can go and figure out if you have issues with your gut, and we're going to tell you exactly what to do and what foods you're sensitive to. Talk about some of your challenges with some of those tests that are out there and what you want people to know about them.
I'll tell you, first of all, that I even thought about doing that, got so far as, even creating the company, working with a business partner and starting to actually test out that idea and software algorithms to help execute them. And at the end of the day, there is no replacement for a human being who knows how to look at your life, all of the things that you've experienced in the environment, and then put that data to the person, right? There's no way a software algorithm can ever do that effectively the way a human being can. Sorry to anyone who's developing that idea out there. Okay.
Right. Maybe one day. We're just not there yet.
We're not there.
We're not there yet. And by the way, this isn't a pitch to get people to come see you or take a test or whatever. Your practice is full, basically.
Yes.
You know, you're not affiliated with this testing company besides you and your dad doing research. He is an advisor,
Yeah.
help them develop some of these tests. This is more just a public service announcement that unfortunately, and we will be there one day, right? Science will catch up and there'll be better ways and we'll get better testing and other things. The idea that a test can tell you exactly what you're sensitive to, we're not there yet.
No.
And like can tell you like which foods to eat and which foods not to eat. We're just not there yet.
Yeah. And that happens a lot with food sensitivity testing, right? At home, pinprick food sensitivity testing, find out what causes your bloating or your cramping or whatever. That is not what food sensitivity testing tells you.
Yeah, what does it tell you? Because you guys will sometimes look, and one of the tests that you did for me was looking at the tests that were there, but you weren't so much focused on the individual food. You were looking for bigger patterns.
Patterns.
What patterns were you looking for?
Okay, so let me caveat this first by saying that the quality of material put into the test always dictates the quality of output. And when you find relatively inexpensive finger prick tests at home versus, you know, what's considered gold standard, much more expensive versions that are done, those two tests mean different things.
Right.
Right.
And in the case, you know, just so we're all clear and transparent and everything, the test that you ran on me was called Cyrex.
Cyrex Array 10.
And you can't just order it as like an individual. You have to work with a practitioner.
Correct.
I don't know if they have a list on their website where people can go and find practitioners for autoimmunity screening, but if you don't, Cyrex, and you're listening, please go and create that because a lot of people want to know what doctor they can be working with to look at screening and addressing the root issues of intestinal permeability and looking at those bigger picture patterns for food sensitivity.
Most IFM certified docs will know about Cyrex. So you could always go to ifm.org and find a practitioner. And
Institute of Functional Medicine.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
All right. So when the immune system inappropriately creates an antibody to a food protein, you really want to try to understand what group of food proteins are you attacking, because it tells you something about the underlying issue, right? It's not that every individual food that the person has an antibody to is the culprit. And if you go through the list of everything that's red and you remove them, you're going to be a completely different person the next day. Right? You're really trying to say, okay, is it, you know, gluten, dairy, corn, or is it going into bigger pictures? Am I starting to react to multiple things in the lectin category, for example, right? Am I having a problem with food additives, food colorings, food glue, gums? We haven't even talked about food glue yet, by the way. But, you know, you want to get some sense of what groups is the immune system having issue with, because that tells you what group of issues may be coming from that or have come from that problem and where the issue actually originates from.
Right. For example, you mentioned some of the things that you had reactions to in the beginning with your symptoms, dairy, right? And gluten, removing them. But often people who have sensitivities there, it's not uncommon that they might also have an egg sensitivity. How does eggs fit in? And would that be a part of one group that you would often find together? Yeah.
So in my mind, you know, I kind of call this the top 5. So gluten, dairy, corn, soy, and eggs.
And it's not that you can never eat those foods. It's not that those foods are bad. It's just that these foods are commonly associated with some of these increased antibody levels, and which is a byproduct of intestinal permeability.
Yeah, correct. In most situations. There are other ways they can come about. But yeah, so these are the 5 most common foods that people will develop antibodies to through the mechanism of a loss of oral tolerance. So in other words, a food that in the first 3 years of life, you programmed your immune system to say these are good. And then at some point down the road in your adult life, you lost that memory or programming. And now you identify them as bad.
Your body does.
Your body does. And that typically happens in the gut through intestinal permeability. So why gluten, dairy, and eggs? Because those kind of fit into their own subcategory. They all have proteins in them that have some molecular similarity. So I think gluten is much, much, much more likely to be the initial problem, right? The initiator of the intestinal permeability, the first food protein that the immune system starts reacting to. And if you continue to eat that food because you don't know that you're having an issue because the inflammation is subclinical, the immune system again lives on these cascades, will up its ante and will say, okay, well, my attack against this protein sequence isn't working. Let me expand a little bit. And it'll go to other protein sequences that look somewhat like the original one, but aren't exactly the same. Casein, dairy protein, looks very similar molecularly on paper to gluten, similar enough that if the immune system wanted to expand its horizon, it'll pick it, right? Egg protein, egg albumin, very similar as well too. Corn and soy go into different categories. So corn has its own inflammatory protein that the immune system has a tendency to react to, aquaporins, very similar to a blood-brain protein that we carry called aquaporins. And then soy is problematic for different reasons, but it contains a group of proteins called agglutinins, which are the bigger, broader group of lectins, and many human beings have an issue with soy agglutinin. So they're the top 5, mostly because they're going to spread downstream from an initial gluten sensitivity, and that gluten sensitivity wasn't caught early enough to prevent that spread.
Are there things that they can do to begin to go down the pathway of starting to repair their gut and hopefully have their immune system start to quiet down a little bit?
Yeah, I think, it's important to recognize that for whatever many people that I've seen in my clinic or have been seen in clinics successfully here in the US, there's probably an exponential larger number out there who have done their own version of healing just by taking the information and implementing it, which is part of the power, I think, of this movement, is that it really provides people a pathway to make yourself feel better. And that's just growing and growing and growing in popularity. The basics of it are remove and then repair. So what does remove mean? Remove means at least temporarily take things off of the table that are perpetuating this chronic inflammatory problem. If you want to think about it simplistically, what's driving the leaky gut? Just, you could say, I probably have it. My immune system is probably in this pro-inflammatory state. How do I take things off that just give that immune system some breathing room? That's following an elimination diet. Start by removing gluten. Do that for a few weeks. See how you feel. If you're not responding, progress to removing dairy. You can go to corn, soy, eggs next. Some people don't want to play that waiting game. Depending on how willing you are, you could go straight to a paleo diet. I mean, a paleo diet is basically playing the odds and saying, it's maybe a grain, it's maybe gluten, it's maybe dairy, it's maybe, corn, it's maybe eggs. Let me just take them all out. Focus on whole foods, minimize my sugar intake. It really is going to cover 95% of people out there. You could just go straight to a paleo diet.
Yeah, the challenge with the elimination diet, step by step by step, it's very exhausting.
Yes.
It takes a long time.
Yes.
I still don't know many people that have done it that exact way, just one at a time.
There are people out there.
There are people out there. I just find it so much easier to do some sort of program where, again, people hear paleo and they think, oh, I got to go eat a bunch of meat. No, it's not necessarily the case. And obviously, if you are a vegetarian, that's fine. You can do that too. You can look up versions of this for that. Mm-hmm. But you're still eating vegetables. You're talking about whole foods, but in particular, you are still removing dairy, because now there's this whole component as paleo has evolved. And this was one of my questions that we'll get to in a minute. The navigation around dairy. Now, some people feel like, okay, actually dairy can be part of a paleo diet as part of their interpretation, but they steer people towards fermented dairy, right?
Sure.
So we'll get to that in a second.
Sure.
But a classic sort of paleo diet where you're focusing on whole fruits, vegetables. Can you do nuts and seeds?
Yeah, I include nuts and seeds in there.
It's really maybe staying away from that early list that you mentioned. Gluten, dairy.
Yep.
Would you put grains in that category?
I think grains would be the next step.
Okay, grains.
All grains would be the next step.
Quinoa, rice, anything that fall in that grain category.
Buckwheat, sorghum. And the reason for that is that people who have really significant gluten sensitivities have a tendency to also have a grain sensitivity as well too. Why that is, I don't think anybody really knows 100%, but theoretically it might have to do with the way crops are grown or stored, or maybe even some cross-reactivity between the proteins there. But gluten, dairy, and then grains would be next.
Yeah, and then if you wanted to go even more sophisticated later on, like maybe they don't have to get to corn and eggs yet. Those are a little bit less, but still they would follow in that cross-reactivity category.
Correct.
But at least for most people, gluten, dairy, grains, that's going to encompass 90% of people, would you say?
And then try to take the opportunity and focus on eating whole, non-processed foods.
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably the most important part of all of this.
Yes. Which will require a little bit of work, but it's like, guess what requires a lot of work? Being sick.
Yep.
Right? Nothing is more expensive than being sick.
Yep.
Nothing will cause you to give up more opportunities, not want to pursue the job of your dreams, not want you to start that new side business that you've been wanting to do, or write that book, or start a podcast, or whatever it is. Nothing will cut off opportunities like being sick. Being sick is the most expensive thing you could possibly do. I just want to remind everybody of that because I've seen it time and time again, and even in my own life.
Yep. When you are sick, you would pay anything to get out of it.
Yes.
Right? So a little bit of an investment in prevention is huge as far as paying dividends.
So they're doing this for, what would you say? Some people say 3 weeks at least minimum.
Well, in theory, if you are having an IgG antibody response to the food, the half-life of those antibodies are somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks. So what does that mean in reality? That means you could stop the gluten exposure on day 1, still have those antibodies rolling in your system in some significant fashion 3 weeks later. And you might not have seen a noticeable effect. So I generally counsel 6 weeks. You want a half-life of those antibodies to kind of come down a significant amount so the immune system can chill out.
Great. So you're doing this for 6 weeks. And one thing that I've personally seen, I'd love to hear your account, is that even by 2 weeks, people start to notice things. What have you noticed that your patients who you tell to do this, or people who write into you who maybe can't afford to come to the clinic or fly out here, and you tell them or give them guidance? You've written a book also. Let's bring that up, Tessa. It's called When Food Bites Back.
When Food Bites Back.
When Food Bites Back.
For the practitioners out there, there is a textbook that my dad and I also wrote called Food Associated Autoimmunities.
Okay,
so both
great.
of them.
Yeah, let's bring up the When Food Bites Back just for those that are looking at Amazon and they can see the cover. It's a person eating a French fry.
Yeah.
When Food Bites Back, Taking Control of Autoimmune Diseases. We're linking to that. And again, even if you don't have an autoimmune disease, this book can be helpful because you're walking people through action items like this.
Yes.
What do people start to notice often, not everybody, but often, even by 10 days, 2 weeks of doing this?
The quickest things that will resolve are brain fog, insomnia, and joint pain. Those are like the 3 things that if they're going to happen, they happen right away.
Wow. Amazing. And immediately right now, there are people who are watching or listening that are like, I want that. So it's like, okay, let's try it, right? What's the worst thing? What's the downside of this? Okay, you spend a little bit more time cooking at home, which is good for you anyway. You're probably eating less processed foods. You're probably eating foods that are going to improve your metabolic health because you're not overeating on grains and starches and other stuff that are out there. So there's not a lot of downside to doing this.
You're testing your commitment to something.
Yeah.
Some people might have some hesitancy to do that, but it's a good challenge for everybody. No question.
So now that you've done this for 6 weeks, what's the next step? You're feeling a little bit better. Maybe some things have resolved. Some things are not 100% better, but they're a little bit better. Where do you go from there at the end of 6 weeks?
So then you want to repair. Right. And repair means 2 things. You want to repair that intestinal lining that's been damaged for all those months or years before you started doing that. Time will take care of some of that, but there are things that you could take to try to accelerate that process. And you also want to repair those pissed off Treg cells. The immune system sometimes could use like an external hug to try to convince it to come down back to its normal balance. So if you're going to do like an intestinal repair, let's say you're doing it with food. The intestinal barrier loves specific amino acids, it loves growth factors, and it loves probiotics. So consuming collagen better, consuming bone broth, making sure that you're intaking a really decent amount of live probiotics in your food, sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir, whatever it is that you decide that you want to do. those are going to do wonderful things for repairing the barrier. And the Treg cells are very much influenced by both probiotics and the thing that they produce when they're in association with fiber, which is a short chain fatty acid postbiotic. So do that. Vitamin D, zinc, fish oil, all those things, if you're going to start taking supplements, can really accelerate that healing process.
I remember reading your book when it first came out, but I don't recall, do you have a protocol inside of there that walks people through this process? Or is there one? Yes, you do.
Yes.
So people can get that inside of the book as well.
My favorite supplements for doing this, foods that you can consume if you want to do this entirely with food, which is absolutely possible. And yeah, it's all in there.
Yeah. And you already mentioned a few of those highlights. Now, a couple caveats for people, and I think you mentioned this the last time you were on the podcast, is a lot of this is also contextual based on how bad things are. People who have had really bad IBS or IBD, which is an autoimmune disease, irritable bowel disease, they start to include even some of these healthier foods that are fermented and have fiber, and it feels like a bomb went off in their stomach.
Mm-hmm.
So they got to go slow, or they might need to focus on more of the reparative process before they can bring in or find the best tolerated versions of those things. In general, they're not going to do well with typically a lot of raw vegetables.
Correct.
A lot of fiber at once if they weren't taking fiber. And that's why you really got to go slowly and see what your body can tolerate. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a subset of people out there, a big subset of people who have these chronic immune problems, and the result that happen as the result of really severe bacterial and maybe even fungal dysbiosis. We call that SIBO, SIFO. I'm sure there are going to be different terms that we start using for it in the future. But essentially at its core, there is an overgrowth of a dysfunctional type of bacteria and or fungus, and also the presence of them in places that they shouldn't be. And bacteria are fermenting organisms. Yeast are fermenting organisms. So as part of their metabolism, they produce a lot of gas. And for some people, if you're going to flood the system with more probiotics or more fiber, raw, uncooked fiber, you're going to really push the gas pedal on that. Not to use a pun, but you're just going to be producing a lot of gas. Essentially, it's going to be really uncomfortable. It might cause diarrhea. It might cause constipation. So in those individuals, you have to consume in this, I think, low fermented diet style. Essentially, you want the veggies to be cooked so that the fiber is broken down a little bit. You want to avoid the consumption of probiotics. And in those people, I actually focus entirely on the postbiotic supplement realm. So those are things like short chain fatty acids. Tributyrin is, I think, the big one in that space. There's a postbiotic from pomegranate called urolithin A, and then a secondary bile acid called TUDCA. So typically when people are really sensitive to the pre and pro side, you're removing the prebiotic foods and then you're just pushing the postbiotic. And eventually over time, for many of those individuals, as you influence the Treg cells to calm down, the immune system will therefore be able to do what it is intended to do, which is to regulate the microbiome.
I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I put my dad on a elimination diet. This was probably 2009. And it was just for him. He wasn't complaining about anything specific, maybe a little bit of joint pain in his fingers, but he was a cricketer. He played cricket, actually professionally in Kenya, and then stopped right around the time that I was born, and then, we moved to the United States. So he just thought maybe it's just injuries from that, a few of his knuckles or kind of his fingers look like a cricketer's fingers, which are gnarly. So he just thought that joint pain is just coming from that. But you know what? I'll try this thing, right? I'll try this thing. So he did it. And by the second week, one of the things he noticed, because he had never not had gluten in his life, and had never not had grains for a period of time. And he did it, and he noticed, I think it was like day 15, 16, 17. It was like a 21-day program that we put him on. He came downstairs and he said, I was living with my parents at the time because I was helping to take care. I just dropped out of college and I was starting my first business. So I was saving on money, but I was also helping to take care of my grandfather who was really sick and had cancer. And both my parents were working at the time, so I was helping my grandmother. He came downstairs and he said, you know, what's really weird is that I haven't had that morning back pain that I've just been used to for years.
Yeah.
I said, that's great, Dad. Like, that's interesting. Like, let's keep note of that and anything else that you come across. Now, when his 21-day period, right, I didn't do the full 6 weeks. I didn't know you at the time.
Sure.
So we did 3 weeks. Still saw some benefits. When that 21-day period was done, there was part of him that even though he had felt better, but it was a kind of a slow process. Even with his back pain, it kind of was a slow process there. And he had spent his entire life eating these foods. He didn't like fully, I'm not going to say believe it, but basically that.
Sure.
Right? He's like, okay, there's something to this, but it's kind of a coincidence. Maybe I also had him on some supplements. Maybe it's the supplements that he was on. So I'll just do the supplements and I'm going to go back to eating a lot of these foods in the same frequency. And I said, okay, yeah, do that, Dad, because even some people, some medical doctors tell people to do this on purpose. They call it the reintroduction phase.
Yeah.
Because they want you to see how you react. Now, in a formal process, you would reintroduce those foods one by one, right? Because if you reintroduce them all at the same time, you don't notice what food did what. So I said, let's at least do gluten and dairy because we're not going to do the whole list that you're on.
Sure.
Let's at least do gluten and dairy. So let's start off with dairy. So you reintroduce dairy. Generally, he was fine. He felt a little bit of stuffy nose, which is still something, but he felt like, okay, I can handle this.
Mm-hmm.
And then a few days later on, after reintroducing dairy a little bit at a time over 3 to 4 days, then he stopped the dairy again and he reintroduced gluten.
Mm-hmm.
And that was immediately the next morning, he noticed that pain come back.
Yeah.
And that was a big aha moment for him.
Mm-hmm.
When you were describing these steps of, you know, stopping certain foods, elimination diet, and then going into repair, how important do you feel a reintroduction process is? And is that worth people trying out to really drive home what foods they're reacting to?
It depends on the context. So if I'm going to do a reintroduction, it's typically going to be for somebody who does not have a known diagnosed autoimmune disease. Because in that context, I don't think it's worth the potential flare of the autoimmunity itself for the reintroduction, because sometimes irreversible damage is done in that flare. So that's the first really important counseling point. If we're just dealing with, you know, no autoimmunity, chronic inflammatory symptoms, you know, I usually will counsel wait until we know for sure that your intestinal permeability is resolved, because that's when we know your physiologic resilience is back, meaning you're more likely to pass the trial, which is what we want. Wait until then, and then we can do a reintroduction. And, you know, depending on the foods that they reacted to, I'll make the list in kind of reverse order of what I think was causing the issue and do the reintroductions a week at a time. Essentially, we counsel people to do 3 days of small introductions sequentially, and then to pause for 4 days and just be sure that over the course of that week, they feel the same as baseline. The idea there is sometimes the delayed reactions will occur for people, and you just want to make sure you're observing that cleanly, and then you move on to the next and the next and the next.
That's great. Thank you for that clarification. So once people go through this repair process, which can take time, right? Your body didn't get sick overnight. Even if you had a flare-up that caused you to really feel like it was that bad to deal with it in the first place, this thing had been building up for years. That whole pre-autoimmunity phase. So once they've gone through this repair process, then sometimes they can start to look at these foods that are there.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, in your case, in your story. You've done repair work on your gut. And what have you found for these foods that you had sensitivities towards, in particular gluten and dairy? In your case, can you eat these foods now? Or do you still stay away from them?
I fall into the unfortunate minority of people who cannot touch even a small amount of these things again.
Because
despite
what
my
happens?
best efforts.
What happens? Because I'm sure you tried at one point in time.
Yeah. If it's gluten, I will get significant IBS like symptoms, and I will get brain fog from it.
Yeah, it's so bad for you that you're like, it's even the best piece of bread from Italy, you know, that has been, you know, anointed by royalty, it's not worth it.
I am to the point I've you know, the what your dad went through with wanting to reintroduce and challenge this paradigm is human nature. It's part of the journey. So I've been doing this since 2005. That's 18 years. I've had many of my human moments where I wanted to challenge the paradigm. And I've had the negative reaction so many times now that I've developed an aversion.
Yeah.
If I even think, let's say I'm in Italy, of trying it, my body just shuts that down and is like, nope, we're not doing that. Focus on something else.
Nothing tastes as good as being healthy feels. And for you, when you eat these foods, you genuinely do not feel good.
Gluten specifically. Okay. Now I can have small introductions of dairy. I will feel perhaps a slight tingling in the back of my throat. I will immediately get pressure in my sinuses. So I think that like sinus irritation that comes from a dairy product is really what I feel. And, you know, it might last a couple of hours. It usually goes away afterwards. And as long as I don't sequentially do it, I'm typically fine.
Yeah. And for you, if you choose to go down that path, right? Are there dairies that you find that are better for you or worse for you? And generally, what have you noticed with your patients? Let's talk about dairy in particular.
Okay, I need give everybody a little bit of background. So we're saying these reactions are happening as the result of the development of IgG or IgA antibodies against the foods. Antibodies react in the three-dimensional space, right? So proteins, peptides, they have three-dimensional and two-dimensional structure. So the state of their three-dimensional structure is what ultimately matters. So it turns out that the three-dimensional structure will change based on the type and preparation of the protein. Case in point, you know, the protein in a raw egg is very different than the protein in a cooked egg because it has a completely different three-dimensional structure as a result of the cooking. So with dairy, you have a wide range, not only of proteins, but also of potential three-dimensional structures in which they could exist. The biggest protein that's inflammatory in dairy is casein. Now, casein exists across the different mammalian dairy products. So it's in goat's milk, it's in sheep's milk, it's in cow's milk. There are slight variations to the casein in the different animals. So sometimes people might have a very strong cow's milk reaction, but nothing to sheep or goat's milk. That's not common. And we've actually looked at this in the literature. We published this in the journal, I think, Dairy, in 2017. My dad and I, anybody could look this up. But most often when you have a cow's milk antibody, it's going to also end up that you have a sheep or goat's milk antibody, but it's by no means 100%. It's probably 30% of people who don't have those reactions. Now, hard cheeses have a different casein structure than a soft cheese. Hard cheeses probably also have less intact protein as just a result of that longer production process. So people have a tendency to react less to a hard cheese like a Parmesan than they would to a soft cheese like a mozzarella. Butter. Butter is not a whole milk product, really. So it has its own proteins, something called butyrolin, that are in there. And it's got a little bit of casein. When you go another level and you start clarifying the butter into ghee, there is even less of the casein in there because you're removing it in the clarification process. So one individual might react to butter. They might not react to ghee. Then with ghee, we have even another level, which is fermented ghee. And in the fermentation process, a lot of those proteins are, again, further denatured out of their three-dimensional structure. So, you know, somebody might react to butter, have a very mild reaction to ghee, and have zero reaction to a fermented ghee. And it all has to do with the amount and type of protein and the three-dimensional structure of the protein in the product itself.
In your instance, do you feel any of those themes for you? So if you do choose dairy and you're out somewhere, whatever family event, Persian holiday, will you choose certain things for you that you know I will still pay a little bit of a price? Maybe my throat will feel itchy, but it's not as extreme. Like you're not going for a whole glass of milk.
No, definitely not going for a whole glass of milk or a dairy ice cream or, you know, a slice of pizza with regular cheese on it. That would be too much. But we Persians, depending on the restaurant you go to, love putting some butter on rice.
Yeah.
And sometimes that butter is pre-mixed into the rice and there's nothing you can do about it. Some restaurants also love slathering butter on top of kebab. So, you know, I'll get some butter exposure. I'll feel that. I definitely will feel a little something, but it's not a huge price to pay.
But you can handle it.
if I'm going to have something that was prepared with a fermented ghee, I probably wouldn't feel it.
You don't ever sneak in a little ghee yourself
No.
into the restaurant and talk to the
Talk
chefs
to the
in
guy in the
Farsi?
back. No.
Well, you probably talk to the chefs in Spanish and tell them, hey, put a little bit of this ghee on.
Yeah, I think they probably would tell me to leave the kitchen. They love their butter. There's no replacing it.
Well, I love sharing a little bit about my story because, I talk about different aspects for me. So I went through a whole gut repair process. For years, I avoided gluten and dairy and other stuff, and my life was better because of it. And then I started to have curiosity about, can I introduce these things back in now that I've gone through this repair?
Mm-hmm.
And I even think a couple years ago, I came to you and I even tested some of these tests and we looked at it. And largely my IgE response was pretty good. Like it showed like I had at least largely healed my gut from where things were before, right? It kind of confirmed a lot of the questions that I had, which is, was I reacting to a lot of different things? And I wasn't. I think there was a couple things that were on there that I had to pay attention to, which was really just an indication of maybe not those foods, but that my gut had been largely repaired. So I found that in particular, for anybody who's watching on video, like I have a big pimple right here on right next to my right eye, right? I'm facing the camera.
You're brave for pointing that out.
I love to, I share all my stuff with my audience, and I generally have really great skin.
Yeah.
But I know if I've stacked the gluten and dairy for a few weeks in a row, little bits here and there, and it's summer, people are visiting LA, we're traveling a little bit, there's cheese at dinner, there's a little bit of sourdough bread, organic, at a really great restaurant. I want to try it. I was in Vancouver. I ate a little bit more than usual. I might notice certain things. First thing I'll usually immediately notice for myself is not 1 day, not 2 days, but let's say like right now at 3 days, even if I have like 1 or 2 servings, like I was in Vancouver and my buddy really wanted me to try this croissant. And he also has a gluten issue. He's a patient of our clinic in Massachusetts. He's like, look, we're going to go. It's so good. You and I are going to go down together if we go down. So we tried it and the croissant was fantastic, right? A big part of life is if you can tolerate these things and you enjoy it, like people understand like food is part of life, right?
Yeah.
And I know I can handle those things, right? 1 croissant, fine. Great. We went back the next day and we had another croissant. And then I had dairy as well. And I was probably at a restaurant that cooked a lot of the food in seed oils later on the evening. So I was stacking a lot of stuff. I did not feel good the next day. And immediately I noticed that I feel a little bit more constipated than normal. And I feel like I have great digestion. So even the tiniest bit of constipation, I'm like, okay, red flag, something's going on. So I start to pull back naturally. That's there. And then we went somewhere else on another trip, my wife and I hadn't had a cappuccino with milk in it in a little while. And the place had organic milk. And I thought, you know what? There's this funny meme on Instagram. It's floating around everywhere. It says, my toxic trait is eating foods that I know that don't work for me, even though I have the whole history of them not working for me. That's definitely one of mine, right? And I had a little bit of dairy, and then I had a cappuccino the next day also too that had organic dairy inside of it. Boom, got a pimple. And it showed up pretty much right away after the second latte the next day. And it was probably not even a full cappuccino. It was like a macchiato type thing.
Okay.
I know this. This is what happens to me. I know that that's the response. And it's usually sort of pain threshold. How much pain do you have? How much vanity? Do we have a wedding that week where I need to look good in photos that a friend's going to, or do I have a big event? Okay, it's just a normal podcast. Fine. I'll get a pimple for that, right? That's basically my own internal logic. So I have, like many people, you kind of find your own tolerance of these things. For me, my gluten situation is not as bad as yours.
Sure.
And for me too, I've also developed a better relationship. Before I said, again, this is for me, I'm not prescribing this for anybody else. I would say I'm never going to have these things. And then when I would include them back in, I would kind of go big on it. And it'd be in Europe or somewhere else. Now, I might have a tiny little bit. I know my threshold. I pause, and then I don't let it get worse into something else. I don't want brain fog. I don't want this thing. I don't want that. So I have my own version of your tolerance for me. So it's those foods I can have infrequently, the highest quality, and in particular for me, for dairy, I have found that fermented dairy I can actually have on a regular basis, like fermented grass-fed Greek yogurt, and I don't get any of the normal symptoms that I would have if I would have traditional dairy that's not cheese.
Sure. So, first of all, the most important thing is that you had the journey of recognizing that things that you were consuming were impacting you. Then you went through the repair phase, and presumably what you did was you took yourself from a path going forward where you were potentially at significant risk of several chronic diseases. And
if I would have had those things on a regular basis.
If you had never made that discovery, if you had just, Drew lived his life oblivious to the fact that food was impacting him, right? That path was one in which your risk of several diseases goes up significantly over the course of your life. You had the discovery process, you went through the repair phase, you put yourself on a different branch in the universe that significantly lowered those risks. That's the most important part of this entire journey. And then step 2 is for everybody, how much of this can I tolerate? Because the reality is that a little bit here or there is not going to put you back onto that other branch that you were on before. It's not even going to cause any significant deviations from that branch. So that question, as you mentioned, is like, well, what can I tolerate? What works for me? This is my life. I presumably only have, one of them. I don't know if I have many of them, but presumably I have one of them. So I want to also kind of think about the enjoyment. And I encourage patients to do that. Again, as long as we're not talking about a context of a known autoimmune disease.
Right. That's a whole different story.
But absolutely embrace the idea that you're living once. You might have a reaction for a day or 2 or 3, and you're going to go back to baseline once you clean everything up, and then everything's good again. It's really that initial part of the discovery, saying that, aha, things in my environment are impacting my health. Because by making that acknowledgement, you will also open your mind horizon to things other than food, and your path will be healthier in many, many ways by kind of thinking in that way going forward. So that's the most important thing. From there, if you can tolerate a croissant or whatever, or every once in a while and nothing major occurs, good for you.
Somebody walks in your clinic today and says, Doc, I'm struggling with X, Y, and Z. What are those top ailments, diagnoses, or diseases where you immediately think leaky gut is part of the equation? Give us a few.
Yeah. So the intestinal barrier, obviously it's in the intestinal system, it's in the gut. So sometimes we get a little bit too honed into the idea that this is going to be a gut-centered process.
Right. Like it's only going to be people who are having bloating or distension or irritable bowel disease. But leaky gut affects so many different things.
It is at the core of the systemic immune system. So I am looking for systemic issues when I highly suspect that someone has intestinal permeability or leaky gut. So someone who is getting sick way too often, that's kind of the first red flag for me. They're getting too many viral infections. They're impacting them for longer periods of time. They're not rebounding the way that they're supposed to.
Even, by the way, I'm still seeing, we're kind of still early in it, but I'm seeing people that got COVID early, got it again, and then are now still in this new wave, have gotten it first in January and then just got it for a second time.
Yeah.
That could be one of those instances as well.
Absolutely. Right. Yes, reinfections occur under ideal circumstances with a balanced, fully functional systemic immune system. You should be pretty well protected. We are seeing people who were infected with BA1 now getting BA2 infections 3 months later. If you have a good immune system, that should not be happening.
Right. Because you have the natural immunity that's not just local for like COVID, is through the history of a lot of different viral, even the flu.
Yes.
Right. If you get the flu, you're more likely not to get the flu for that season, at least. Okay, great. So I kind of went off on a tangent. What are a couple other ones? So the first one is if somebody's getting sick often, colds, COVID, whatever it might be, the flu, what is another thing in that mix?
A very diminished metabolic reserve. So this is a otherwise healthy, relatively young person should be able to have the energy to go out and do what they want to do. They just don't have it. They can't work out as much as they want to. They can't go to social events as much as they want to. They need way more rest than they should.
Got it. So anything that is typically taxing, and exercise is a taxing, it's a stressor on our body, but it's a good stress, leads to all sorts of other positive reactions from that. But anything that's taxing the body, they're noticing they can't handle that tax in the same way as normal.
Right.
And could that also include, every so often people you just had your 40th birthday, by the way.
Yep.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm sure you ate and drank a couple things that maybe you don't typically eat and drink. Right?
I was a little taxed after that.
That's part of life.
Yep.
But somebody, And we don't always need to be perfect, nor is it really likely that we could do that, especially if we've made changes in our diet or we avoid sugar or other things like that. So sometimes we'll eat foods or drink things that we don't always have. So if you get really thrown off by those, could that be an example of what you're talking about as well?
Yeah, I think having prolonged bad days after an exposure to something that you're not usually exposed to, definitely a sign that your overall reserve capacity is not what it's supposed to be. Whether it's antioxidant reserve, mitochondrial reserve, immune reserve, something there, your tank is not full. You don't have the ability to replenish.
Okay, and we're going to go into why these examples and unpack them. You had a third one, and it has to do actually with our brain health. How is our brain health connected to leaky gut?
They are directly connected to each other. So the barrier at the intestinal lining, the leaky gut intestinal barrier, is very, very structurally similar to the blood-brain barrier. So if someone has an inflammatory impact at the gut barrier, they are very likely to have an impact at the blood-brain barrier. According to our own study, it was 60 to 70% overlapping prevalence of having both leaky gut and leaky brain. So I see leaky gut, I'm thinking leaky brain at the same time.
Wow, that's fascinating. And like in your office, if somebody's sitting in front of you and they're talking about it, so one example of a leaky brain or like your brain's not working as well could be what? What are some examples, either early symptoms or diagnoses that somebody's dealing with?
It's usually on the early side, very subtle things. So, you're talking to a 40-something-year-old, 50-something-year-old, 60-something-year-old, and they're going to tell you about things that they notice about themselves that they're going to brush off as being related to normal aging. Right. So they don't recall names as well as they used to. They can't follow, mathematical tasks the way that they used to. They can't do the crossword puzzle the way that they used to, right? Oh, I'm just getting old. No, that's not the way biological aging is supposed to occur in those decades, right? There is something hindering structural cell performance in the brain, and that thing is usually an inflammatory cascade.
So that's one example of like early, but also to the full blown aspect is that at your practice here in Los Angeles, you guys also see like full on cognitive decline, and you are trained in the Bredesen protocol. We've had Dr. Dale Bredesen on the podcast before, does a lot of work and research in the space of Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. So how is it that leaky gut can be connected to something as early as like full blown cognitive decline?
So again, the intestinal barrier is the gateway to the systemic immune system, the gateway to the local enteric nervous system, and can be connected to the brain directly via the systemic blood and also via the vagus nerve. So when you have things happening at the localized gut level for a prolonged period of time, that is without question going to, at some point down the road, impact the brain directly, either through the blood or by transmitting something up through the vagus nerve. So that could be many, many things, right? Let's say it is intestinal permeability, leaky gut, related to a gluten sensitivity, something that we see very commonly. That person is ingesting a food that's damaging the lining, the immune system starts reacting to that food locally at the gut. You create a prolonged inflammatory cascade, and what should be an open and shut barrier now remains open, and what is on the inside of the gut can just pass through that barrier into the blood. And what do we have plenty of inside of our gut? Bacteria. So a bacterial toxin, something that's part of the normal structure of the bacteria living inside the gut, will now make its way into the blood in a quantity and also frequency that it was never intended to to happen. So you have a bacterial toxin in the blood, eventually downstream going to go enter the blood-brain barrier, from there enter the brain. We have great examples of that in the medical literature, very well understood. One of them is the effect of lipopolysaccharide, a gut bacterial outer surface protein toxin that in Alzheimer's patients, for example, enter in very large concentration through the blood-brain barrier and into the brain and end up at the center of amyloid plaques. So there's no greater illustration of a gut-brain axis disruption. You have something that originated in the gut, went through the barrier, made its way into the bloodstream, from the bloodstream went to the brain, through the barrier in the brain, then in the middle of the brain, right? And it was clinically silent the entire time. That was going on for 15, 20, 25 years. The person had no idea until they had Alzheimer's disease, right?
What were you taught about leaky gut in medical school early on? And, how did you end up learning the truth about leaky gut and how central intestinal permeability, by the way, for everybody listening, I think most people know this by now, leaky gut, intestinal permeability kind of like go hand in hand together. They're the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But what did you learn about it in medical school?
Well, we learned about the possibility for what you call transcellular or paracellular permeability. So transcellular would be something passing directly through the barrier cell. And then paracellular would be something happening in the gap between the cells. So leaky gut is paracellular permeability, the opening of that gap, essentially. We learned that was basically impossible. That the paracellular part of cells themselves were stuck together. I remember very clearly learning that was essentially concrete or glue, right? And I started med school in 2000. This was essentially the same time that Dr. Fasano was publishing his initial research on zonulin and intestinal permeability, and learning that is not true. This is not concrete. This is a physiological part of our immune system. We open up those barriers so we can send white blood cells into the gut lumen, check out what's going on, pull them back, send that information to the rest of the immune system. So we open and close the paracellular barrier on purpose all the time.
And, we talked a little bit about your background and your father's work on the last podcast, but just as a little tiny refresher, you had a firsthand experience with leaky gut, intestinal permeability in your own life. Just if you could refresh our audience, because not only are you the doctor that's helping people, you actually were the patient at one point in time in a way.
Yeah. So going to my first couple of years in med school, I struggled a lot physically in completely unexplained, unexpected ways. I was getting sinus infections nonstop, literally every single month on the dot. I would start getting a sinus infection, go see the local doc, at the medical school clinic, take an antibiotic, it would resolve, and the hamster wheel would begin over and over and over again.
Going back to your first sign of somebody who regularly has autoimmune type things or leaky gut, getting sick often.
Absolutely. I was much more fatigued than I expected to be. I'm 19, 20 years old at this point, right? We have med school from, at that time, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. You had the rest of the time to yourself. Sure, we studied for a couple hours, but, it wasn't as demanding as medicine would be later on in life, especially during internship and residency. And I was struggling a lot. I wasn't sleeping well. I had a hard time keeping up with the load. And though at Berkeley in undergrad, I did very well, didn't have, a difficult time, the cognitive load of everything was also difficult for me too. And I guess, fortunately for me, maybe the universe shined on me a little bit at this time. This was when my dad was developing his next generation food sensitivity testing and also looking at, what's going on with the gut. We didn't have zonulin at that time, right? Because Dr. Fasano was really just understanding and learning about this. But, my dad started looking at gut mucosal dysfunction as well as food sensitivities. And part of growing up with a brilliant immunologist as a dad is that he's going to draw blood from you all the time. And he would usually draw my blood to try to use me as a control for something that he was developing. And, I told him everything that was going on. And he said, come into the lab. I went to USC, so I was back here at home, and his lab was in Beverly Hills. And he said, come into the lab, let me draw some blood from you, and let's just see what's going on. And, he called me afterwards and said, you have a dairy sensitivity. At the time, especially in med school, young, early 20s, I didn't believe it. This was not something that I thought was possible. As I mentioned to you, leaky gut was being told to me as being not possible, right? So he tells me I have these issues, food sensitivities, gut mucosal immune problems. Initially he says, pull out the dairy, pull out the gluten. I didn't even know what gluten was at the time, right? So I said, okay, I'll start with one of them. You're a smart guy. I know you have my interest at heart here. I'll listen to what you have to say. Let's try it out, right? So I eliminated dairy. And what I remember was immediately breaking the cycle of the sinus infections. Done. No more sinus infections, no more monthly visits, no more recurrence. And I was convinced that, what he was saying to me was real. So followed with gluten. And the immediate thing I remember in the week after I removed gluten was that I slept like an absolute baby for the first time in a long time. And I would wake up sharp, refreshed, ready to hit class, ready to hit the books, and just started absorbing everything like a sponge again. So I look back on that and really that's a huge turning point for me, right? It allowed me to reach my potential in med school, allowed me to, continue on in residency and fellowship and function at a high level without issue. I mean, I definitely was the med student who everybody looked at and said, what in the world are you doing with the way that you eat? This is weird, right? But I didn't care because I knew how I felt. Right. And 20 years ago, it was difficult to execute a gluten and dairy-free diet. It's much easier now. So I'm enjoying the progress that the world has made in that time. But it was worth it to me because I felt a night and day difference. I felt the way I should have felt when I was 22, 23, 24, right? Even though I had a lot going on, I was able to meet that demand.
Now, part of today's podcast is that we're helping people understand not only what leaky gut is, but also signs that if they're suffering from having a leaky gut or intestinal permeability. And I think it's always beautiful when, especially physicians like yourself, open up about their own stories that have suffered from it, because anybody can become, just because you're highly educated in one area or another, it doesn't mean that you can't suffer from the trappings of the modern world. Now, one of the things that you mentioned that was a key factor, it seems, in your intestinal permeability was food sensitivities. So we're going to get back to foods in a second, but just high level, what are some other things that are there in addition to food that can create the onset of leaky gut in somebody's body? And by the way, you have a new book out. We talked about it last time, but it's available on Amazon. It's called When Food Bites Back. We have the link in the show notes as well, and people can check it out. And goes deep in the topic of food. We're going to be unpacking some of the stuff that you wrote about in here. But before we get back to food, a couple other things high level that can create the onslaught of leaky gut.
Okay. I want to start off by saying that I want to have respect for the idea and notion that we don't fully understand this yet, right? Though I understand a lot more than some other physicians, we still don't fully have this mapped out. What I have seen in the medical literature that also seems to ring true in clinic with the thousands of people I've seen at this point is I think they're outside of the foods. Stress is a huge part of leaky gut. Chronic emotional stress, which we all experience at some point, I kind of think of as a primer, right? 2, medications. And there's a few in that medication category, but 2 big ones that stand out to me. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatories are very, very potent triggers of intestinal permeability. And antibiotics are very potent triggers of intestinal permeability. And then the third category is chemicals. You and I were having a chat before we started about food additives, food coloring, gums, glues, right? The way that we grow our food, having lots of pesticides and glyphosate associated with them. There are, so many things in that list as potential very strong triggers of intestinal permeability. It's hard to keep track, but I'll say chemicals, particularly glyphosate, to me is a very big trigger. So, you're living in the modern world. You're getting lots of exposures to these things all the time. We experience lots of emotional stress. It's very difficult to pinpoint one. I think it's really all of those things that we talked about.
Let's so just to recap those for the audience, we have stress. You had chemicals as well, and then drugs, and you gave a couple particular types of drugs.
Yeah.
Let's look at those. So what is stress doing to the body, like both chronic stress, where somebody's experiencing a heavy load of stress in their life from work or from some sort of situation they might be in, but also like very key stressful moments. I often hear from friends that I refer to people's practices. I've sent some people to your practice, other practices before. I said, it's the first time a doctor asked me, what was going on in your life emotionally when that disease or for those symptoms first started for you. So why do you ask questions like that? And what is stress doing that would be impacting that barrier inside of our body?
All right, I'll answer the first part. So then we'll go on to the immunological mechanisms. Why do I ask that question of my patients? One of it, part of it is experience. I think the more that you spend time in the healing arts trying to work on something purely scientific, purely physiologic, purely, let's say, just immune system, you're going to find yourself hitting roadblocks over and over again with that patient that don't make sense on paper, or at least don't make sense immunologically. And the thing that you have to understand is that we as human beings are very complicated, and we are physiologically impacted by the way we feel and perceive our world. So if I'm going to be effective as a healer, I have to understand that and incorporate that into my treatment algorithm, into the way that I approach this. This is a complicated human being who's had a life, who has emotions about many things. All of that needs to be addressed if we're going to work on their immune system. So experience has given me that humble lesson that I'm going to be at my best. I'm going to help the person in front of me the most if I address their emotional state and their immunological, physiological state. That's backed by literature, by the way. I remember one of the studies that kind of opened my eyes a little bit about this was a retrospective study on MS patients from the University of Pittsburgh. I can't remember the exact year, but a very high percentage of the flares of their MS patients were triggered by a significant emotional event prior to the flare. So, the effect of the emotional state on the immunological state to me is 1-to-1.
Yeah, like if you have all of a sudden a death in the family, how's that not going to impact your health?
Right.
We all know that you can become so stressed that you can get an ulcer. Right. But you can also get so stressed that your body becomes in total panic mode. And if that stress continues with other insults, dietary, chemicals, food exposures, whatever it might be, that can have some serious impact on your body.
Yeah. So let's take the ulcer example because it's a good segue into the physiology of this, though I don't think we really understand it very well. But, the classic stress response is the adrenal stress response and a big release of cortisol as part of that fight or flight mechanism. Cortisol, being a potent steroid, will have immune modulating effect. Depending on the amount and the context, typically you're either going to upregulate the immune system for a short period of time, or if it's a very large release, you're going to suppress the immune system. You also change metabolic dynamics as well too, increasing the amount of glycogen output from the liver to increase the amount of glucose in the blood. I think that there have to be very significant stress-induced changes to the more advanced part of the immune system as well too. Though there are some suggestions of how that occurs, we don't have full understanding of those mechanisms. To me, I think people who have very significant day-to-day emotional stressors, you'll see very wiped out immune systems for them. You'll see their T cells depleted, and specifically the big, traffic cop of the T cells, which is a T regulatory cell, you'll oftentimes see very dysfunctional. That's the thing that's trying to control all of the sides and create balance. And it's unable to do so because it's very deficient.
One thing I like in your book is that you go through and you share all these different patient stories that are there, little case studies, reports, maybe changing it or only keeping the patient's first name or putting a different name for their privacy. Is there a patient that you can remember in your thousands of patients you've seen over the years who it was very clear that this stressful situation that happened to them, whatever it might be, was the beginning of what ultimately led to the unraveling of all these symptoms that were later for them? Anything that comes to mind that you can share with our audience here today, like a particular situation, event, something in their life that they knew they went through, they knew it was a stressful situation, but they didn't make that connection between that and then their disease state that was there?
Yeah, I can think, as you're saying that, I have like a flood of memories of different patients where that's occurred. I have a particular patient who is very, very dear to me, a woman in her 50s, a few autoimmune conditions, very difficult to kind of say how much work went into this from a lifestyle perspective, but let's say years of work in lifestyle medicine trying to help control, I think some of the autoimmune issues. And it wasn't until that patient gave me the honor of discussing some of the trauma from the past and that she got a chance to connect the dots that her father's death 3 months before the onset of autoimmunity was the trigger for her, that we actually started making major headway.
Right. And it's not that we're saying that, okay, somebody passes away in your family and immediately you're going to get an autoimmune disease. It's just though in her case, that might have been, in functional medicine, they use this analogy of like a cup filling up, drip, 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 another drip of water.
Yeah.
And slowly that cup fills up over time. So it could be in her case, you mentioned she was 50 when you saw her. She maybe didn't have the best diet, and that's a few drips that are there. Then she has some food sensitivities. Then there's some chemical exposure. Then other aspects that are there. And then you're maybe not working out as much. And who knows what all the combination of things are for her. And then you get a major stressor that comes in, the passing of a father in this instance. And then that's that final pour, then the whole glass of water ends up overpouring.
Absolutely. The immune system works on cascade levels, cascade layers, right? So you've got all of these things that happened on the road to that event that put the immune system in the unfortunate perfect situation to be tipped over. And that tipping over event for some people could be an antibiotic. It could be extended use of a nonsteroidal. It could be, a food poisoning event, or it could be an emotional stressor, a very significant emotional stressor. They're all equivalent to the immune system. It sees all of them the same, whether we understand them from a physical perspective or we don't. To the immune system, they end up being the same thing.
You mentioned drugs as another category that we talked about. And we've done a lot of episodes on this podcast, and I think there's a lot more awareness in the community, in the health community as a whole, that antibiotics, right, have so many positive aspects to them and were a major part of keeping humanity healthy and other stuff. Then there became the overuse of antibiotics. In the cases of antibiotics being a key aspect of somebody's journey of inducing leaky gut, what are some examples of why somebody might have continued or been exposed to antibiotics as one drug to treat one thing, but nobody told them that it could cause something else? Are there examples of diseases, issues, something that people are trying to treat with regular antibiotic usage?
To me, the most common area where that pitfall occurs is sinus infections.
Sinus infections.
Yeah. And oftentimes somebody will be experiencing a sinus infection or what's suspected to be a sinus infection, giving an additional or initial round of an antibiotic. 14 days later, they've taken the antibiotic. Hey, doc, my symptoms are still there. Oh, the problem is we didn't use a strong enough antibiotic, right? Then a second one is implemented for 14 days. Symptoms are still there. We just didn't use it for long enough, right? Then you get another 14 days, sometimes a third antibiotic to follow that. And we're talking about oral systemic antibiotics for a localized mucosal immune system. So what has happened in that situation is you have created an extraordinary amount of damage to the microbiome, created intestinal barriers that are open, and who knows if you triggered that immunological cascade or not, but the likelihood is going to be high.
So let's connect the dots for people. So you're taking an antibiotic, right? In this case, you're talking about people getting prescribed from their doctor, again, well-intentioned, not following the latest and the best science that's out there, but hey, that's not the doctor's fault. It's not being taught in medical school.
Absolutely.
So they're being given an antibiotic. So what is the role of bacteria when it comes to that barrier in our body? And how do our bacteria keep us healthy and safe?
So the entire mucosal immune system, particularly the small intestinal epithelial layer, that barrier, contains signal receptors. So it is, let's say, constantly putting an antenna out to survey the internal environment. And it is looking for patterns. They are called pattern-associated receptors or pattern recognition, right? So what patterns is it looking for? It's looking for the presence of healthy immune cells and the presence of healthy microorganisms, whether they are bacteria or yeast, or vice versa, the lack of healthy immune cells or dysbiotic organisms. And if it senses a lack of healthy immune cells and dysbiotic organisms, it is going to upregulate all of the immune system in the mucosal barrier, which makes someone much more prone or likely to end up with a permeability event, and that permeability event being prolonged rather than being able to resolve.
So kind of like I came back from travel abroad, come back into the country, you have to go through customs. And just to use a crude analogy here, but let's say there's a breakdown of the border at the airport for where customs is, to determine, again, keeping politics and everything else aside, just talking about basic country borders. All countries have borders. There is a customs that's trying to say, okay, hey, are you a citizen of this country, or do you have a valid reason to be here, or do you have a visa, whatever. So we're saying in a way, those protections, which our bacteria can be a part of, if they're not there, or if they're not a part of the equation to help keep that border safe, then the hawkish individuals in charge will say, hey, we need to line up a bunch more soldiers and let's be on high alert because we could be being attacked from invaders from the outside.
Yeah. And a couple of innocent bystanders are going to get picked up along with the bad guys along the way, because when everything is so heightened and they're looking for a problem, they're going to get not only the bad guys, but some of the good guys too.
Totally. I'm brown. Hey, let's go shoot everybody who's brown. And it's like, hey, hold on. I'm Indian. We're peaceful. Chill.
Yeah.
But I'm going to get shot anyway because the immune system is super ramped up.
Yes.
So that's good for people to understand, because we often want to see the human body as like these individual little silos that don't communicate with each other. And like you said, we don't fully understand it, but we know enough to know there is a deep intelligence that's going on where all these systems are relying on each other. So the idea that we can take an antibiotic, again, well-intentioned, incorrect, but well-intentioned for, let's say, sinuses, sinus infection, and it not have an impact in some sort of other area is actually kind of crazy when you look at it through the lens of functional medicine.
Yeah, especially when you want to even zoom out a little bit and say, okay, well, the antibiotic was going to work if there indeed was a bacterial infection in the sinuses, and that bacteria was uniquely responsible for the inflammation of the sinus and was also susceptible to the antibiotic that you gave, right? So, but we have no mechanism to determine if the bacterial agent is actually the cause of the inflammation of the sinuses. And in fact, many things can inflame a sinus and create the perception of a sinus infection, and you would be getting the antibiotic for what purpose in that reason, in that situation, right?
Even though sometimes, sometimes people do get an antibiotic and they feel a little bit better.
Right.
In the case of a sinus infection, what is actually happening in that situation where they do feel a little bit better? Again, there's overuse, and that leads to degradation of the gut and it may not even be the best solution. The best solution would be, hey, why are you getting so sick so often?
For
sure. What's going on in the first place?
Right. The appropriately functioning, balanced mucosal immune system that lives just next to that layer of your sinuses is to clear out bad bacteria, bad yeast, viruses, whatever. So you should be asking a question about what is holding the mucosal immune system back from doing what it's supposed to do, right? My whole idea is, how do I get this person's body back to doing what nature designed for it to do incredibly well? And when it comes to why antibiotics work sometimes for sinus infections, even though it may not have been a bacterial infection.
Yeah.
Well, why does a Z-Pak work for a cold sometimes, right? It's a very, very good question. Azithromycin, doxycycline, many other antibiotics have actual immune modulating property. So they will take an overly active immune system and decrease its activity. And the way you feel that is inflammation present, inflammation gone. So your presumption, if you connect those two dots, is, oh, it must have been bacteria. But you're forgetting that the drug itself has anti-inflammatory property. How does it exhibit those anti-inflammatory properties? We don't entirely know. I think one of the most reasonable theories is that in our modern world, we have very overpopulated dysbiotic guts. And if you take an antibiotic, you're going to temporarily relieve the burden of that. The immune system will see that, will calm down for a period of time, and there'll be systemic anti-inflammatory effect. The drugs themselves may also have direct impact on the immune system as well. It's a little bit of a debate. Probably both are true. But just because you took an antibiotic doesn't mean you killed the bacteria that caused the sinus infection.
Hey YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
If they're not actively strength training, then I can almost guarantee 100% that they have metabolic dysfunction, because they're not building muscle, and your muscle is what's protecting you against metabolic disease.